In 1974, a secret agreement was made in the deserts of Saudi Arabia that would reshape the global economy for the next 50 years. No treaty was signed, no vote was taken, no public announcement was made, but that deal gave the United States a power more valuable than any army: the ability to print money that the entire world was forced to use. They called it the petrodollar, and it worked brilliantly, ruthlessly, 4 separate times to preserve American dominance. Even as the country's industrial base crumbled, its debt exploded, and its currency should have collapsed. But here's what they're not telling you. The system is breaking. The deal that has funded American empire for half a century is being quietly dismantled by the very countries that made it possible. And when it finally falls apart, the economic consequences will be unlike anything we've seen in our lifetimes. This is the secret history of the petrodollar. 4 times it saved America from collapse, and now the world is preparing to move on. To understand the petrodollar, you have to understand what came before it: the Bretton Woods system. In 1944, as World War II was ending, representatives from 44 nations gathered in New Hampshire to design the post-war financial order. The result was simple and brutal. The US dollar would be the world's reserve currency, backed by gold at $35 per ounce. Every other currency would be pegged to the dollar. And because America held most of the world's gold reserves after the war, roughly 2/3 of all monetary gold in the world, this arrangement made the dollar as good as gold itself. For 2 decades, it worked beautifully. The dollar was stable, international trade flourished, and America enjoyed extraordinary privilege. It could print money to fund its government, its military, and its lifestyle, while other nations had to earn dollars through exports or drain their own reserves. But there was a problem brewing beneath the surface. America was spending far more than it was earning. The Vietnam War was costing billions. The Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, welfare expansion, added more billions. And a growing trade deficit meant dollars were flooding out of the country faster than goods were coming in. Under Bretton Woods, those dollars circulating abroad were supposed to be redeemable for gold. Foreign governments and central banks could, in theory, show up at the US Treasury and demand their gold. And by the late 1960s, that's exactly what they started doing. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, was the most aggressive. De Gaulle understood what was happening. America was printing far more dollars than it had gold to back them. He called it America's exorbitant privilege, and began systematically converting France's dollar reserves into gold. He even sent French naval vessels to New York Harbor to physically collect the gold bars and transport them back to Paris. Other nations watched and began to wonder if they should do the same. The math was undeniable and terrifying for American policymakers. The United States held about $10 billion in gold reserves, but foreign governments and central banks held over $50 billion in dollars. If even a fraction of those dollars were presented for redemption, the United States would run out of gold. The entire Bretton Woods system would collapse, taking American financial dominance with it. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on national television and made a stunning announcement. He called it the Nixon Shock. The United States, he declared, would temporarily suspend the convertibility of dollars into gold. He promised it was a short-term measure to protect the dollar against speculators. That temporary suspension has now lasted over 50 years. Overnight, the dollar became what economists call a fiat currency, backed by nothing but trust in the US government. No gold, no silver, no tangible asset, just a promise. And logically, that should have been the end of American financial dominance. Why would the world continue using dollars if they were no longer anchored to anything real? Why wouldn't countries just trade in their own currencies, or switch to a basket of currencies, or return to gold-backed money? For a few years, chaos reigned. Currencies floated against each other. Exchange rates became volatile, and the international monetary system seemed on the verge of fragmenting into competing blocks. The dollar's value fell. Inflation surged. America's post-war economic miracle appeared to be ending. But American policymakers weren't going to let the empire die quietly. They needed a new anchor for the dollar, something that would force the world to keep using it even without gold backing. And in 1973, a crisis gave them the opportunity. The Yom Kippur War erupted in October 1973 when Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel. The United States supported Israel with massive military aid. In retaliation, Arab members of OPEC imposed an oil embargo on the United States and other Israeli allies. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight, from about $3 per barrel to nearly $12. Gas stations across America ran dry. Lines of cars stretched for blocks. The economy convulsed. But crisis creates opportunity, and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger saw an opening. In 1974, Kissinger traveled to Saudi Arabia to meet with King Faisal and his advisors. The meeting was secret, and the details of the agreement were not made public for years. But the essence of the deal was straightforward and revolutionary. Saudi Arabia would agree to sell all of its oil exclusively in US dollars. No other currency would be accepted. In exchange, the United States would provide military protection, advanced weapon systems, and a guarantee of the House of Saud's survival against internal and external threats. But Kissinger demanded more. The Saudis would also agree to take their massive dollar profits from oil sales and recycle them back into the United States by purchasing U.S. Treasury bonds and other American assets. The dollars would flow out to pay for oil, then flow right back in to fund American debt. And critically, Saudi Arabia would use its influence to convince the rest of OPEC to adopt the same system. Within a short time, virtually all oil-producing nations agreed. Oil would be priced and sold in dollars only. This was the birth of the petrodollar system. And it was the first time the pattern worked. Here's why it mattered, and why it was nothing short of financial genius. Oil wasn't just any commodity. It was the lifeblood of the global economy. Every car, truck, plane, and ship ran on it. Every factory needed it. Every military depended on it. Plastics, fertilizers, pharmaceuticals, countless industries required petroleum products. Oil was non-negotiable, and if oil could only be purchased in dollars, then every country on Earth needed dollars. It didn't matter if they liked America, trusted its currency, or approved of its policies. If they wanted energy to power their economies, they had to hold dollars in reserve. They had to earn dollars through trade. They had to maintain dollar liquidity. Suddenly, global demand for dollars was structural and permanent. America could continue printing money because the world was forced to absorb it. The dollar didn't need gold anymore. It had something better. It had oil. And unlike gold, which was limited and static, oil was consumed constantly. The demand never stopped. This was financial engineering at its most sophisticated. The United States had lost its gold anchor, but it had created a new anchor: black gold, petroleum. And unlike the gold standard, which limited how much money America could print, the petrodollar had no such constraints. As long as the world needed oil, and as long as oil was priced in dollars, demand for dollars would be infinite. The first act of the petrodollar, from 1974 through the 1980s, allowed the United States to survive the economic chaos of the 1970s. Inflation raged, reaching double digits. Industrial jobs disappeared as manufacturing moved overseas. Real wages stagnated. The economy lurched from recession to stagflation. By every measure, America's economic fundamentals were deteriorating. And yet, the dollar remained the world's reserve currency. Why? Because the world had no choice. Every nation needed dollars to buy oil, and therefore every central bank had to hold dollars in reserve. The petrodollar system had locked in demand regardless of America's economic performance. By the early 1980s, a second pattern emerged that made the system even more powerful: petrodollar recycling. This was the hidden mechanism that would define global finance for the next 4 decades. Here's how it worked. Oil-producing nations, particularly the Gulf monarchies, were accumulating absolutely staggering amounts of dollars from selling oil. Saudi Arabia alone was taking in billions per month. But what were they supposed to do with all those dollars? They couldn't just let them sit idle. They needed to invest them, earn return, and protect their wealth. And the United States, working through the Treasury Department and Wall Street banks, made sure there was a very attractive option: invest those dollars right back into the United States. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and other Gulf states began funneling hundreds of billions of dollars into U.S. Treasury bonds, American stocks, real estate, and corporate debt. This wasn't charity or coincidence. It was a carefully orchestrated system with enormous benefits for the United States. Think about the cycle. America imported oil and paid for it with dollars it could print at will. Oil producers received those dollars and accumulated massive surpluses. Then, those same producers loaned the money back to America by purchasing treasury bonds, effectively financing the U.S. government's budget deficits. The money never really left the American system. It just circulated in a loop. This arrangement gave the United States the ability to run enormous trade deficits and budget deficits simultaneously, something that would destroy any other nation's currency. Normally, if a country consistently imports more than it exports and spends more than it collects in taxes, its currency collapses. Investors lose confidence, capital flees, and the government is forced into austerity. But the petrodollar recycling system meant that no matter how much the U.S. government spent or how large the trade deficit grew, there would always be foreign buyers for treasury bonds. The oil producers had no choice. They were drowning in dollars, and the safest, most liquid place to store them was in U.S. government debt. This was the second time the pattern worked. The petrodollar wasn't just a pricing mechanism. It was a perpetual motion machine that kept American debt cheap, American interest rates low, and American living standards artificially high. The numbers are staggering. By the 1990s, Gulf oil producers alone held hundreds of billions in U.S. treasuries. By the 2000s, the total foreign holdings of U.S. debt exceeded trillions, with oil exporters as some of the largest creditors. To this day, Saudi Arabia holds over $100 billion in U.S. Treasury securities, and that's just what's publicly reported. The actual number, including holdings through offshore entities and proxies, is likely far higher. But the system had a darker side. Because the petrodollar was so central to American power, any threat to it was treated as an existential threat to national security. And by the 1990s and 2000s, some countries were starting to ask dangerous questions. Why should we be forced to use dollars? Why can't we sell oil in our own currencies, or in euros, or in a basket of currencies? The answers to those questions came in the form of bombs and sanctions. Iraq, under Saddam Hussein, made a fateful decision in the year 2000. Facing UN sanctions and seeking to thumb his nose at the United States, Saddam announced that Iraq would begin selling its oil in euros instead of dollars. He framed it as a matter of sovereignty and economic pragmatism. The euro was a strong currency, and Europe was one of Iraq's largest customers. To most observers, this seemed like a minor policy shift, barely worth noting in the financial press. But in the logic of the petrodollar system, it was an act of economic warfare. If one major oil producer could break the dollar monopoly, others might follow. The entire structure of dollar dominance, the mechanism that allowed America to print money and export inflation, could begin to unravel. In March 2003, the United States invaded Iraq. The stated reasons were weapons of mass destruction and Saddam's alleged ties to terrorism. Both claims turned out to be false. No weapons of mass destruction were ever found. The terrorism connections were fabricated or exaggerated. But one of the first actions of the U.S.-installed Iraqi government was to switch oil sales back to dollars. The euro experiment ended. Iraqi oil once again flowed exclusively in dollars. Now, I'm not saying the Iraq War was fought solely over the petrodollar. Wars are complex, driven by multiple factors: geopolitics, regional power struggles, ideology, the influence of defense contractors and oil companies. But the petrodollar was certainly part of the calculation. Saddam's challenge to the dollar system made him an enemy that needed to be removed. Libya's Muammar Gaddafi made a similar mistake, though his was even more ambitious. By the late 2000s, Gaddafi had grown rich from Libya's oil exports and had begun positioning himself as a leader of Africa. He proposed the creation of a pan-African currency, a gold-backed dinar that would be used for oil sales across the continent. He argued that African nations should stop using dollars and euros imposed by former colonial powers and instead trade in a currency backed by Africa's own gold reserves. Gaddafi used Libya's oil wealth to lobby other African leaders, and he began selling some Libyan oil in currencies other than the dollar. He even explored accepting gold as payment. In 2011, NATO intervened in Libya's civil war, under the pretense of humanitarian intervention, protecting civilians from a dictator's crackdown. NATO airstrikes destroyed Gaddafi's military forces. Rebel groups, supported by Western weapons and intelligence, hunted him down. Gaddafi was captured and killed in October 2011. Libya descended into chaos, a failed state with competing governments and militias. But one thing was clear: Libyan oil sales returned to dollars. The gold dinar was never mentioned again. Again, the intervention had multiple motives. But Gaddafi's challenge to the dollar system had made him a target. The pattern was becoming clear. Challenge the petrodollar and you risk everything. Iran learned this lesson the hard way. After the 1979 Islamic Revolution, Iran had already been on bad terms with the United States. But in the 2000s, facing international pressure over its nuclear program, Iran began actively trying to escape the dollar system. It opened an oil bourse, an exchange where oil could be traded in currencies other than the dollar, including euros, yuan, and even barter arrangements. The response from the United States was not military invasion, but something almost as devastating: financial warfare. Iran was hit with the most comprehensive sanctions in modern history. It was cut off from SWIFT, the global banking messaging system that facilitates international transactions. Iranian banks were blacklisted. Foreign companies doing business with Iran faced secondary sanctions, meaning they could be banned from the U.S. market. The result was economic devastation. Iran's currency collapsed. Inflation soared. Ordinary Iranians saw their savings evaporate and their standard of living plummet. The message was unmistakable: you can try to escape the petrodollar, but we will make you pay. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez and later Nicolas Maduro, also attempted to sell oil in non-dollar currencies and barter arrangements, particularly with China. Venezuela faced crippling sanctions, asset freezes, and diplomatic isolation. Its economy collapsed into hyperinflation, and millions fled the country. This was the third time the pattern worked, through weaponization. The petrodollar wasn't just maintained through economic incentives, it was enforced through sanctions, covert operations, and occasionally military intervention. Any nation that seriously threatened the dollar's monopoly on oil trade was crushed, either economically or militarily. The system was brilliant in its coercion. It didn't require constant invasions or occupations. The examples of Iraq, Libya, Iran, and Venezuela were enough to deter others. The implicit threat was clear: stay in the dollar system or face ruin. And for decades, it worked. The petrodollar remained unchallenged as the foundation of global finance. American power seemed unshakable. But enforcement has a cost, and by the 2010s, the cracks in the system were becoming impossible to ignore. The 2008 financial crisis was the first major warning sign. The collapse of Lehman Brothers and the ensuing global panic exposed just how fragile and interconnected the dollar-based financial system had become. The crisis originated in the United States, with reckless mortgage lending and Wall Street speculation, but it metastasized into a global catastrophe. Banks failed across Europe. Trade contracted worldwide. Unemployment soared. And how did the United States respond? The Federal Reserve created trillions of dollars out of thin air through quantitative easing, a euphemism for printing money. The government bailed out banks, car companies, and insurance firms with taxpayer funds. The national debt exploded. For other countries watching this unfold, a troubling question emerged. If the United States can simply print unlimited dollars to solve its problems, and if the entire world is forced to use those dollars, aren't we all subsidizing American irresponsibility? The answer, of course, was yes. The petrodollar system meant that when America printed money, the inflationary consequences were exported to the rest of the world. Everyone holding dollars, which was everyone, paid the price. Then came the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020, and the money printing reached levels that would have been unthinkable just years before. The Federal Reserve created another $5 trillion. Congress passed stimulus packages totaling trillions more. The national debt surged past $30 trillion with no plan, no intention, and no realistic possibility of ever paying it back. To many nations, particularly those outside the Western Alliance, this looked like madness. The United States was living far beyond its means, funding its lifestyle by printing a currency the world was forced to accept. And anyone who complained or tried to opt out faced sanctions, or worse. But the most significant shift came with the weaponization of the dollar system itself. For decades, the U.S. had used sanctions as a tool of foreign policy, but these were generally targeted, specific individuals, companies, or sectors. After Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the United States and its allies took an unprecedented step. They froze Russian foreign reserves, hundreds of billions of dollars that Russia had accumulated and stored in Western financial institutions. This was a financial nuclear weapon. It sent a chilling message to every other country, particularly those outside the Western sphere. Your dollars, your treasury bonds, your reserves in the U.S. financial system, none of it is really yours. It can be seized, frozen, or weaponized at any moment for political reasons. If you were China, sitting on over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds, what would you think? If you were Saudi Arabia, with hundreds of billions invested in American assets, how secure would you feel? If you were any nation with a complicated relationship with Washington, would you want your national wealth stored in a system that could be turned against you with the stroke of a pen? This was the turning point. The petrodollar system had always been coercive, but it had been tolerable because there was no alternative. Now, the coercion was becoming unbearable. And alternatives were finally emerging. Enter the BRICS nations: Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These 5 countries represent over 40% of the world's population and a growing share of global GDP. And for over a decade, they've been quietly, methodically building the infrastructure to escape the dollar system. It started with currency swap agreements. Instead of trading through dollars as an intermediary, countries began agreeing to trade directly in their own currencies. China and Russia established a yuan-ruble swap line. India and Russia arranged to trade in rupees. Brazil and China made deals to trade in reais and yuan. Each agreement was small individually, but collectively they represented a chipping away at dollar dominance. Then came the creation of alternative institutions. In 2014, the BRICS nations established the New Development Bank, headquartered in Shanghai, as an alternative to the Western-dominated World Bank and International Monetary Fund. Its purpose was to fund infrastructure and development projects without the political conditions and dollar requirements that came with IMF loans. They also began working on a BRICS payment system to rival SWIFT, the Belgium-based messaging network that handles most international financial transactions. SWIFT had been weaponized against Iran and Russia, cutting them off from the global financial system. The BRICS nations wanted an alternative that couldn't be controlled by the West. But the most aggressive actor has been China, and China's challenge to the petrodollar is the most serious threat the system has ever faced. In 2018, China launched the petro-yuan, oil futures contracts denominated in yuan and traded on the Shanghai International Energy Exchange. For the first time, major oil producers could sell their oil for yuan instead of dollars. And to make the yuan attractive, China offered a crucial feature. Yuan earned from oil sales could be converted into gold through exchanges in Shanghai and Hong Kong. This was a direct challenge to the petrodollar. China was offering oil producers a choice: continue trading in dollars, which are backed by nothing and can be weaponized against you, or trade in yuan, which can be converted to gold. The response was slow at first, but it's been building. Russia, facing Western sanctions, now conducts most of its oil and gas trade with China in yuan and rubles. Iran, also sanctioned, sells oil to China in yuan. Even Saudi Arabia, the architect of the original petrodollar deal, has begun accepting yuan for some oil sales to China, its largest customer. In 2023, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman made a stunning statement in an interview. Saudi Arabia was open to discussing oil sales in currencies other than the dollar. He didn't say the petrodollar was dead, but he didn't reaffirm its exclusivity either. The ambiguity itself was significant, a signal that the once ironclad agreement was now negotiable. China has also been accumulating gold at an extraordinary pace. The People's Bank of China has been adding to its gold reserves every month for years, building a stockpile that now officially exceeds 2,000 tons. And many analysts believe the real number is much higher, as China has a history of underreporting its gold holdings. Why would China be hoarding gold unless it was preparing for a monetary system where gold backing mattered again? Meanwhile, China's Belt and Road Initiative has been financing infrastructure projects across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, often in yuan rather than dollars. Ports, railways, power plants, all built with Chinese financing, denominated in Chinese currency. These projects create dependencies, but they also create yuan circulation and demand outside of China. Russia, cut off from the Western financial system by sanctions, has embraced de-dollarization with the fervor of a nation that has nothing left to lose. It has sold off nearly all of its U.S. Treasury holdings. It has shifted trade with China, India, and other partners to local currencies. It has even discussed linking its payment systems with China's to create a sanctions-proof financial network. India, while more cautious, has also been diversifying. It has arranged to buy Russian oil in rupees. It has been increasing its gold reserves. It has joined discussions about alternative payment systems. Even traditional U.S. allies are hedging. The European Union has been working for years to increase the international role of the euro, explicitly to reduce dependence on the dollar. France and Germany have called for a more multipolar currency system. Japan, while still closely aligned with the U.S., has been quietly diversifying its reserves. The pattern is unmistakable. The world is preparing for a post-petrodollar era. Not next month, not next year. But the groundwork is being laid. The infrastructure is being built. The alternatives are being tested. This is the fourth act. And this time the pattern isn't working. The petrodollar system is not collapsing overnight. These transitions never happen suddenly. But the momentum is shifting. And once it shifts far enough, the collapse can be surprisingly swift. The dollar's reserve status is like a dam. It holds as long as confidence holds. But confidence is a fragile thing. And once it cracks, the water doesn't seep slowly. It floods. And here's what most Americans don't understand, because they've never experienced it. The consequences of losing reserve currency status are catastrophic. For 50 years, the United States has been able to run massive trade deficits, importing far more than it exports, because the world needed dollars. American consumers bought cheap goods from China, Europe, and everywhere else, paying with dollars that those countries then recycled back into U.S. Treasury bonds. It was a free lunch. When the petrodollar system breaks, that free lunch ends. If the world doesn't need to hold as many dollars, demand for dollars falls. When demand falls, the value of the dollar falls. Imports become expensive. That cheap television from China, those affordable clothes from Bangladesh, that fruit from South America, all of it gets more expensive. Inflation surges, not because of temporary supply shocks, but because the currency itself has lost value. At the same time, the U.S. government will face a funding crisis. For decades, it has spent more than it collects in taxes, funding the gap by selling Treasury bonds to foreign buyers. But if those foreign buyers don't need dollars anymore, who will buy the bonds? Domestic buyers can't absorb trillions in new debt every year. The Federal Reserve could step in and print money to buy the bonds, but that just accelerates inflation. The government will face brutal choices. Slash spending by cutting Social Security, Medicare, and defense, politically impossible and economically devastating. Raise taxes dramatically, also politically toxic and economically damaging. Or print money to cover the shortfall and accept runaway inflation, possibly even hyperinflation. None of these options are good. All of them will be painful, but one of them will be necessary. Interest rates will skyrocket. The U.S. government currently pays relatively low interest on its debt because Treasury bonds are considered the safest investment in the world. But if the dollar loses its reserve status, that safety premium disappears. Interest rates could double or triple, meaning the cost of servicing the $30 trillion national debt could consume the entire federal budget. The middle class will be devastated. Most Americans hold their wealth in dollars, bank accounts, retirement savings, pensions. When the dollar loses value, that wealth evaporates. Real estate might hold value better, but if interest rates surge, housing markets could crash. Stocks might provide some protection, but in a currency crisis, markets are volatile and unpredictable. This isn't speculation, it's what happens to every country that loses reserve currency status. Britain experienced it after World War II when the pound sterling lost its dominance to the dollar. The British standard of living declined sharply. The empire unraveled. Britain went from a superpower to a mid-tier economy in a generation. The same pattern played out in earlier eras with the Dutch guilder, the Spanish peso, and every other reserve currency that eventually fell. The transition is always painful, always disruptive, and always resisted by the declining power, until it's too late to manage gracefully. So when will it happen? That's the question everyone wants answered, and the honest answer is no one knows. These systems are resilient until they're not. They persist longer than rational analysis suggests they should, propped up by inertia, network effects, and the lack of a clear alternative. But the signs are multiplying. Every non-dollar oil trade is a crack in the foundation. Every currency swap agreement is a brick removed from the wall. Every sanction that weaponizes the dollar system accelerates the world's search for alternatives. The BRICS nations are expanding. In 2024, they invited Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, Ethiopia, and Iran to join, potentially creating a bloc that controls a massive share of global oil production and trade. If this expanded BRICS develops a functioning alternative currency or payment system, the tipping point could come quickly. China is patient and strategic. It's not trying to replace the dollar overnight. It's building the infrastructure, the payment systems, the currency swap lines, the gold reserves, the trade relationships, so that when the transition happens, the yuan is ready to fill part of the void. Not as the next global reserve currency necessarily, but as one of several regional currencies that collectively replace the dollar's monopoly. The petrodollar worked 4 times. It saved America from the collapse of Bretton Woods by creating a new anchor for the dollar in oil. It recycled oil wealth back into U.S. debt, funding decades of deficit spending. It crushed any nation that tried to escape through sanctions and intervention. And for 50 years, it preserved American dominance, despite deteriorating economic fundamentals. But the fourth act is different. This time, the system is facing challenges it can't suppress. China is too big to invade, too economically important to sanction, and too strategic to intimidate. Russia has already been cut off and has nothing left to lose. Saudi Arabia is hedging because it sees the future. The world has spent the last decade building the tools to move on. And once enough of those tools are in place, once enough oil is sold in yuan or euros or rupees, once enough countries have reduced their dollar reserves, the system reaches a tipping point. And after the tipping point, collapse can be swift. In 1974, America made a deal in the Saudi desert that gave it 50 years of financial dominance. It was a brilliant piece of strategic thinking, a masterclass in how to preserve power when the fundamentals have shifted against you. But deals don't last forever. Empires that believe their dominance is permanent are always shocked when it ends. And the petrodollar, for all its genius and ruthlessness, was always a temporary solution to the problem of a currency backed by nothing but force and inertia. The world is preparing to move on, not because it wants to, but because it has to. Because America overplayed its hand, weaponized the system, and left too many nations with no choice but to build alternatives. The petrodollar is dying. Not today, not tomorrow, but the process has begun. And when it finally ends, Americans will wake up to a world where their currency is no longer special, their debt is no longer cheap, and their standard of living is no longer subsidized. History doesn't repeat, but if you ignore it, it will crush you all the same. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. The truth is in the patterns.